Hello everyone and welcome to another video. Extreme Heights is a scenario that requires a massive 4,500 guests to complete, and a few months ago I beat it with just 7 tiles using a tiny roller coaster, 1 path piece and a burger bar. A little while later this setup improved to just 4 tiles. It's still generally the same strategy, but it's a bit more optimized. People ride the coaster and after that they will no longer want to leave the park as long as they stay happy and well fed. This does take a few hundred hours to do as you have to manually relocate the guests, but eventually you will get to the goal of 4,500 guests, while also keeping your park rating high enough to not fail. This 4 tile solution seemed as good as it could get, as a ride is at least 3 tiles large and you need a path piece on a 4th tile to access the ride. But recently we discovered that guests don't actually need to ride a ride to stay in the park, as just heading for a ride or stall can be enough. We can use this to beat Extreme Heights in under 20 in-game years, which is slightly quicker than before, but you will need more tiles to build a ride extreme enough for the guests to head to, so this setup is not more optimized for space. However, a few weeks ago I discovered a new strategy that will allow us to beat Extreme Heights with just 2 tiles, and it goes like this. First, remove all the crap that you start with until you have just 1 path tile left. Then build a balloon stall, hire 1 entertainer and you're done. Yes, this setup will eventually get you to the required 4,500 guests without ever letting your park rating go below 700. And the best thing is, you don't even have to do anything. You can just leave your computer, come back about 20,000 hours later and you will have beaten it. The big question of course is, how? How on earth does this keep guests in the park? And that is a very good question, as when we look at the guest list we see that they really don't stay in the park at all. Guests don't buy souvenirs like balloons until they've ridden at least 2 rides, so this balloon stall is entirely useless to them and they pretty much just see this as an empty park. After a few minutes the game checks if there's a ride to head for, and if they can't find any, which they obviously won't, the guest will leave the park. So then how does this work if guests aren't staying in the park? How are we going to get to 4,500 guests? Well, when I was doing some tests in Ghost Town for my video about beating the game without guests riding rides, I discovered something weird. The idea I used in the video is that you can make an infinite amount of money by just having 1 info kiosk at both entrances, allowing you to make enough to build the 10 coasters to beat the scenario without guests ever going on any rides. For the footage in the video I was going to run the park for 500 or so years and show you how much money I had made in that period. At first it's going fine and we make about 10 to 25 euros of profit a month, and several hundred if it rains, as the guests then buy 20 euro umbrellas. And there is no reason for this to ever change, right? Unlike with rides, the age of a stall has no impact on how much guests want to pay for the items. Guests simply buy a map and if it rains also an umbrella and leave after a few minutes, making space for a new guest to do the same. However, despite all this, when I checked back 200 years later, I had way less money in the bank than expected based on shorter tests. And sure enough, in months without rain, we were suddenly losing money. The amount of guests in the park is still the same, with between 30 and 40, but we're selling way fewer park maps. How is this possible? Well, there may still be the same number of guests in the park, but they are not all brand new guests. We have had over 32,000 different guests enter the park, but if we take a look at the guest list, we see that some very old guests have still stuck around. Something has caused them to not leave the park and stick around forever, which leaves less space for new guests, which in turn kills the profit. Okay, we know now what happened and why we no longer make a profit, but why? Why do these guests never leave? And why is it only about 1 in 1,000 guests that has this special property? To figure out what's going on, we need to do some experiments. Let's first see what happens if we simply remove the info kiosk. This causes all of the guests to pretty much immediately leave. In fact, this also happens if we just close it instead of deleting it. Okay, interesting, but what if we, for example, add a drink stall? This also makes them leave, as does adding some extra path. Okay, so we can't change very much or the delicate balance will be disturbed, but what if we replace the info kiosk with a different stall? If we use a cheat to build when the game is paused, this will effectively happen instantly, so the guests won't leave because there's briefly no stall. This time they do stick around. From this we can conclude that it's got something to do with walking back and forth on the same path tile that prevents them from leaving, and the stall also fulfills some kind of role as it does need to be open. This is the bit of code that forces the guests to leave if they haven't ridden a ride yet, and it's part of a larger function which is named tick 128 guest update. Notice that this bit only executes if all of the conditions in this if statement are true. The guests are not heading for a ride, they haven't ridden any ride, they're not already leaving the park, and they're not outside of the park, so the final four are always true. That only leaves to check for whether they are currently walking or not. If they are not walking every time the code executes this part of the tick 128 guest update function, then the guests will never leave the park. If we take a look at one of the guests, we can see that every time they bump into the information kiosk, it briefly says at information kiosk 1, and this is the clue. At this point they are interacting with the shop and their state is set to buying while they decide whether they want to buy something. So if every time this function is executed, the guests are at the info kiosk, they will never leave the park. This means that they need to walk back and forth at the exact same frequency that the function is executed, or a multiple of it. We can see that if we look at the energies of the guests. Guests can spawn with a lot of different energy levels, but among the guests that stay in the park we see just 4 different levels. This means that only if they have one of these energy levels they will walk at the correct speed to synchronize with the tick 128 guest update function. This still doesn't explain everything though. There are only 64 possible energy values for newly spawned guests, and if 4 of those synchronize, then about 1 in 16 guests should stay in the park, not the 1 in 1,000 or so that we see here. The reason for this is that not only do they need to have the correct frequency, but also the correct phase. If the frequency is correct, but every time the function executes they are for example at the park entrance, then it doesn't do anything, it doesn't make them stay in the park. The tick 128 guest update function is, unsurprisingly, called every 128 ticks, or every 3.2 seconds, for every guest. And every 4th time, or every 12.8 seconds, it tries to make the guest leave if it hasn't ridden a ride yet. However, it is not simply called once every 128 ticks for all the guests at the same time, as that would cause tons of tiny lag spikes. Instead, it is executed on every single tick, but only for a few guests to spread it all out. On tick 1 it does guest 1, 129, 257 and so on. Then on tick 2 it does guest 2, 130, 258 and so on, all the way until tick 128, where it does guest 128, 256, 384 and so on, after which it goes back to guest 1 at tick 129. So for every guest this function is executed at a different time, and only if this aligns exactly with them bumping into the info kiosk and they have the right energy level to synchronize, they will stay in the park forever. Not only does this prevent leaving, but it also prevents a bunch of other things from happening. There is another function that can cause the guest to leave the park, but this one is executed at the same frequency as the other one and also requires the guest to be in some sort of walking state, so this won't execute either. Their happiness, energy, hunger and thirst levels never change, as the functions that change those values are also skipped if the guest is at a stall. The energy never changing is especially important, as otherwise they would start walking at a slower speed over time and desynchronize. The only thing that can change their stats is an entertainer, as that happiness increase does still work. Once their happiness is maxed out though, these guests are essentially frozen in time, cursed to a life of walking back and forth forever. Interestingly, I did manage to make them leave without changing anything. I wanted to record them walking back and forth for a while so that I could write down the exact times they bumped into the information kiosk so that I could calculate their frequencies. However, despite the fact that these guests had all been in the park for dozens of hours, every time I tried this they suddenly left within a few minutes. Somehow watching the guest must impact something that causes them to walk at a slightly different pace, causing them to go out of sync. By the way, all the code I've shown you here is from OpenRCT2, as the original game is written in the assembly language and is not nearly as easy to read. In this case it doesn't matter, as it is a perfect translation. This behavior works exactly the same in the vanilla game. Now that we know how and why the guests stay in the park, we can return to our setup in Extreme Heights and see how long it will take to complete it. Before we start though, I want to quickly address the balloon stall in the room, as this is different from the information kiosk in Ghost Town. This trick actually works with any stall, except the toilet and the first aid room, as guests actually go into those instead of just buying something at the counter. The reason I'm using a balloon stall here is because I think it's funny and it looks good in a YouTube thumbnail with all the bright colors, although using the cash machine in the scenario without money available would have been quite funny as well. We've seen that this will take a very long time, so I'll not only use OpenRCT2's speedup function, but also get out the cheat engine for a total speedup of about 750 times, although as we slowly get more guests this will naturally slow down as there's more to deal with. After I set this up, I went to bed, and when I woke up in the morning I checked the autosaves to see how many guests we had at some years that are round numbers, because humans love round numbers. After 100 years, which is about 90 hours in real non-sped up time, we are in the mid-50s, nowhere near even just a tenth of the goal of 4,500 guests. And only about 25 of these are actually stuck in the park, the others are new guests that will leave very soon. 400 years after this, which is 500 years into the run, we have passed 100 guests and are now chilling in the 120s. We're really making some good progress here. This would have taken about 450 hours without a speed up, and we're about 3% of the way there. Outside of the massive guest goal, there's also the 700 park rating that we need to stay above at all times. This is rather easy here though, as the entertainer makes the guests happy enough to give us 500 rating from happy guests, and the stall gives 200 rating for having a perfect ride up time. As the number of guests in the park increases, our park rating will slowly increase as well, as you can get up to another 153 from your guest count. Alright, let's take a big jump now and go to the year 2000, just 1 year after Rollercoaster Tycoon 1 came out. We now have almost 600 guests in the park, which is actually a lot more than we should have based on the previous number. There were about 100 guests stuck in the park after 500 years, so you'd expect there to be about 400 after 2000 years, but it's actually about 560. I'm not sure why more guests are now sticking around, but it is useful. Maybe it has something to do with me pushing the game to its limit with the speed up, but I don't know. We'll do one final jump to the year 10,000, or rather 10,001, because that's when 10,000 years have passed. It only says 1809, but that's because it rolls over back to year 1 after 8,192 years. Well, actually it didn't, and I did see it display 10,001, but the version I'm doing this run in couldn't save that yet, so when I reloaded it, it did roll over. At this point we have nearly 2,500 guests, which is more than halfway to the goal, and this is where I'm stopping. In the first overnight run I got to the year 6200, but it took another 15 or so hours to get to 10,000. This is because whereas at the start I could reach speeds up to about 750 times the normal speed, the extra guests here now make it so that I can only reach about 130 times speed up. This will of course only get worse as we get even more guests, and it would probably take over a week of non-stop running to get to the goal, which is too long for me. We can of course roughly calculate how long it will take. If it took us 10,000 years to get to nearly 2,500 guests, it will take us about 18,150 years to get to the goal of 4,500. There is of course some uncertainty in this, but it's a good enough answer for me. In real time, without any speed up, this would be about 16,500 hours, which is nearly 2 full years. Luckily we didn't need to wait that long, but even with the massive speed up it took about 24 hours just to get past the halfway mark. This strategy will work for any other guest goal scenario that doesn't have a time limit, such as Lucky Lake or Six Flags Over Texas, but because it's rather slow it's not very useful for anything else. For scenarios with the park value goal there is a different, very overpowered trick and you can click here to learn all about it. Thank you all for watching and I will see you in the next video.